Welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. 4 years after Rumsfeld's famous shock and awe, it is American troops who are shocked by the deadliness of the insurgents. Dismissed as Saddam's bitter enders, they emerged as a sophisticated mobile fighting force pledged to end the occupation. Iraqi and American estimates differ on the strength and popular support enjoyed by the insurgency, but both agree they are facing a persistent, lethal, and intelligent enemy. Here is Ayman Muhyiddin.
They've been called the insurgents, the terrorists, the militants, and the resistance. But do any of these names accurately describe those fighting in Iraq, wreaking havoc on the innocent and killing thousands of Americans? There is no single description for all those fighting, nor is there a single motivation. It's been widely believed that those fighting in Iraq fall into three main strands driven by three varying motivations.
The violence in Iraq has a lot of driving forces behind it. Everything and everyone from regional to international interference.
First, international Islamist groups such as Al-Qaeda. They were formerly led by Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. Now they are united by the common belief that toppling the current Iraqi government and ousting the Americans will be the beginning of a pan-Islamic caliphate, or empire. They consist of Sunni fighters from around the world, and they believe they are fighting a global jihad. They have been known for carrying out some of the deadliest suicide bombings and beheadings. They target both American military and Iraqi civilians, diplomats, and journalists. The second grouping of fighters are local Iraqi Islamic groups. They carry out attacks in hopes of ridding America and wresting Iraq away from the influence of Iran and what they believe are its Shiite proxies inside Iraq. They are mostly popular among Iraqi Sunnis. Considered to be mainly Sunni Iraqis, their aim to establish a single unified Islamic state within Iraq's territory. And the third and perhaps weakest of the three, secular nationalists hoping to topple the Iraqi government, ousting the Americans, and establishing a secular Arab state. They are often referred to as the former regime elements or Baathists, the party once headed by Saddam Hussein. But since the bombing of the Golden Shrine in Samarra, a fourth strand has emerged. Militias or death squads, loyal to sectarian groups, are now operating in Iraq.
The most dangerous now are the death squads and the militias, who have infiltrated the ministers of defense and the minister of interior, which are part of the Iranian agenda.
Those fighting may be motivated by different reasons and competing for different interests, but in the final analysis, one common objective shared by the majority of those fighting is to bring an end to America's military presence in Iraq. Ayman Muhyiddin for Inside Iraq.
Well, to discuss the issue of Iraqi insurgency, I'm joined from Washington by Ellen Leibson, President and CEO of Henry L. Stimson Center, a prestigious American think tank. From Amman, we are joined by Dr. Saad Naji Jawad, a professor of political science at the University of Baghdad, and also from Cairo by Brigadier General Safwat al-Zayat, who is a military analyst and an expert on Iraqi resistance and American involvement in Iraq. Welcome to Inside Iraq. Dr. Saad, what lies behind the difference in the usage of resistance versus insurgency?
Well, to start with, Jassim, with due respect, I would like to object to your introduction in which you have never mentioned the resistance once. You spoke only about insurgency. What we have in Iraq is a heroic, nationalist, patriotic resistance against an illegal, unjust, and inhuman occupation and occupier. Of course, I must also say that we do have, and this is again thanks to the occupation, terrorist groups operating in Iraq. We do have sectarian wars, sectarian violence. We do have sectarian militias. We have mafia groups, kidnapping groups, and all these sorts of things which we never had before in Iraq are operating in Iraq. But that does not mean we only have those. We have a resistance that is really
that being the case, Dr. Saad, it's quite convenient, Ellen Leibson, for the American administration to call the resistance/insurgency foreign-driven and jihadist, and it is not a nationalist movement.
I think people are coming to realize that it is not credible to blame all of the violence in Iraq on outside forces. Of course, as Dr. Jawad said, it was the American invasion that generated some of this new activity, this terrible period that Iraq is going through. So yes, indeed, at least one outsider is responsible, but to some extent I think we've come to understand that even if al-Qaeda has been active in Iraq and has transferred some skills to various Iraqi groups, that most of the violence is Iraqi on Iraqi or Iraqi against the coalition forces. It is difficult to say that the outsiders, such as Syria, Iran, al-Qaeda, are the source of all of the violence in Iraq today.
Brigadier General Safwat al-Zayyat, is this winnable militarily, or does it have to be politically? Can really the Americans and the British suppress this insurgency? Let us just remind the viewers what Donald Rumsfeld said. He said insurgencies normally they last 8, 10 to 12 years. Is that what we are going to see in Iraq?
I think that no, because you know that insurgent now is very, very clever in their doing what they want to do. I think that by reading all the figures and numbers during the last 4 years, we show that there is a progressive in many sides with respect to casualties of American, with respect to even casualties in civilian Iraqi and in Iraqi security forces. Even in this matching between political events and between their struggle for their objectives. I mentioned exceptionally during last October, before congressional election, they raised their attacks per day about 70%, and they inflicted more casualties, about 132 American soldiers. I think that they are deeply rooted in the social society of Iraq, and they do well, and they will be continue.
If that is the case, Ellen Leibson,
yeah.
On what basis Vice President Dick Cheney said that, believe in 2005, that the insurgency is in its last throes, and yet the graph from 2003 until that statement showed really a big spike, let alone now in 2007, it is raging?
Well, I am outside of government now, so people in government sometimes have their own way of thinking. They look at data that is presented to make them feel that they're making progress. I think in hindsight, some of his analysis has been way off the mark.
And yet, still military generals, including the last intelligence estimate, project the idea, let alone the new surge, that this thing in Iraq is winnable militarily. The very idea that propagated by General Keane.
I think very few Americans believe that it is truly winnable. They have tried to avoid using terms like victory or success. I think on the American side, everyone is trying to manage some kind of last chapter to what I think is seen as a great disaster for American foreign policy, and clearly a tragedy for the Iraqis. So I think very few people are talking about victory or success these days.
Dr. Saad, when the political process in Iraq started, everybody, whether the Iraqis or the Americans or the British, they said, as the political process unfolds, we will see the end of the insurgency, and yet the reverse happened. As an Iraqi, somebody who witnessed this over the past 4 years, what is the reason for it?
Well, the problem is, Jassim, the American administration has no policy at all in Iraq or for Iraq, and they had no policy. They did not have any idea about what to do in Iraq after removing the old regime. They started by sending people who know nothing about Iraq. They started by dividing the country. They started by destroying the country, demolishing everything, removing the army, the police force. So they did not have anything workable in Iraq afterwards. Then they went to the sectarian policy, quotation policy, and then the marginalization of everybody else. Whoever was in Iraq is a traitor and a supporter of Saddam Hussein. Whoever came from abroad is a nationalist, and he should be the one who is ruling Iraq. of course, the Iraqis are not accepting these things. So, the government, the American government is continuing this policy. Up till now, they are changing faces from people they brought with them, and the Iraqis did not have any opportunity to do anything in Iraqi politics. So the resistance and the majority of the people of Iraq are always and still against American policy and cannot see anything positive in their policy. That's why they are continuing their protest against this this policy. Of course, Mr. Cheney, as you have said,
Saad mentioned something about the marginalization. If you hold with me just a second.
Let me just say this word. I mean, if you go back to history again, between 1964 and 1970, American presidents will always tell us that they are winning the war in Vietnam and they will end the problem sooner rather than later, but we know what the result was.
Alan, the word marginalizations of the Sunni Arabs keeps creeping up as if it is the overarching reason for the insurgency, the resistance, if you will, that is happening in Iraq. Is that your reading for it, or is it much deeper and much wider than that?
Well, I think there's a deeper trauma in Iraqi politics, and Iraqis are learning to try to create a new political culture in which you now have Shia majority rule. I think the Sunnis are deeply traumatized by their loss of political status, and it does seem, and I don't want to speak for them, but that they really are having trouble understanding that they are actually a small minority and that their interests would maybe be best served by aligning with other minorities in Iraq to
try to blame the Americans
mitigate.
For it. They look at the new rulers in Baghdad. They came on the heels of the American tanks. That's the reason for it.
I think initially American efforts were an attempt to get a very balance and participation by all Iraqi communities, and I think they misunderstood how angry the Sunnis were and how disaffected they were. I do know that Ambassador Khalilzad in Baghdad for the better part of a year has been working very hard to try to persuade at least some of the Sunni leadership that their best strategic interest is in coming back into mainstream politics in Iraq, and that still remains, I think, an important American objective.
Alan Leibson, thank you very much. We'll take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll ask our military expert whether this thing is winnable militarily. Stay with us.